Welcome to a new lecture. Today we are going to look at the origins of criticism in Europe, the formalist movement, Russian formalism, and also explore some of the early theories of the novel, so the early principles of narratology. The term literature can refer to the body of oral and written records of a particular culture or community of people. It can include any written material such as poetry, novel, essays, etc., especially works of imagination characterized by excellence of style and expression and by themes of general or enduring interest. The Oxford English Dictionary refers only to writings, but before the expansion of the printing press, much literature was disseminated in the oral tradition that took the form of myths, legends, and also epic poetry. In another one of our lectures, you can take a look at the evolution of the oral tradition and myth criticism. For centuries, the theoretical discussion on literature was related to poetry. The words literature and littérature have been used in their current sense for barely 2 centuries. It had a completely different meaning, for example, in Dr. Johnson's early dictionary. And it is often pointed out that the new term corresponds to a new kind of relationship between the author and the readers. Literature and literary criticism form a network of relationships that involve not just the authors and critics, but also the publishing industry, education, and even adaptation to other media formats. People employed in schools, universities, educational institutions to teach literature not only examine different texts and invite commentary and critical analysis from students. Some of these people, particularly in the universities, are also part of the critical establishment because their jobs also include research and publication, which helps in giving visibility to authors as well as other critics. From the late Middle Ages to the 18th century, literature predominantly referred to the intellectual property of a person, signaling his or her knowledge of letters, books, and languages. This early usage of the term did not include imaginative, creative, or aesthetic aspects of literature. The literate or literary persons were the privileged classes and the social and economic elites. The aesthetic aspects of literature began to be emphasized during the Romantic period. And a consequence of this was a greater positioning of art and literature in terms of beliefs and values of a society. In the Western world, the teaching of literature and literary criticism is documented as far back as the Greek philosophers. Both Plato and Aristotle included reflections on the nature of art and literature as forms of representation of reality. An awareness of the author who controls the text and correlatively implied an inferior and inactive reader, a passive receptor who was acted upon by the text and the author. From the Aristotelian ideas on catharsis to the search for harmony and equilibrium after the Renaissance, didactic and instructional trends to persuade readers in the 1700s, or the rise of passionate feelings conveyed by the author in order to share aesthetic and sublime pleasures of imagination with the reader in the early 1800s during the Romantic period. The history of literary theory shows the changes imposed by all these sociocultural shifts. Early criticism came from mostly philosophy. For example, Spinoza, Theological Political Treatise from 1670, raised relevant issues regarding the question of interpretative truth, or whether literature provides any kind of veridical knowledge as distinct from its purely aesthetic and imaginative inclinations. These inquiries brought Spinoza to be excommunicated as a renegade Jew by the Synagogue of Amsterdam in 1656, and his writings thereafter condemned for atheism. For they suggested that religious truth was a matter of power relations, since God's word was revealed only to a privileged set of individuals who could interpret them, and thus authorizing only clerics as interpreters and commentators, a claim that was also raised in Christianity by Martin Luther a century before Spinoza. So truth figures mainly as a kind of sacred preserve, a repository of values inherently resistant to time and change. And meaning, on the other hand, is that which denies all forms of canonical closure, all attempts to identify the interpreter's role with the faithful handing down of unquestioned self-authorizing truths. Spinoza's discussion was taken up again in the work of the so-called New Criticism. At the end of the 18th century, literature came to mean also the occupation of professional writers and the production of books. This idea of professional activity is evident, for example, in the Godwin family, who owned their own bookshop, the Juvenile Library, which opened in 1805 and specialized in children's literature and using this literature as means of education. During the Romantic period, a time of nation building, the word literature also came to mean a body of writings produced in a particular culture and in a particular period, and popular literature, such folk tales and local legends, also began to be seen as part of the literary canon, undergoing a simultaneous nationalization and aestheticization during the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. The development of a national literature was not free from cultural values, since it encapsulated what the Romantic term the spirit or Geist of the nation and the age. It is during this period that literature became laden with socio-cultural aspects in a big way. Romantics like William Wordsworth or Samuel Taylor Coleridge focused particularly on metrical writings, excluding novels and romances as candidates for poetic status. Romanticism brought the subjectivity of the poet to the center of critical and theoretical attention. Personal expression became the goal, not only for the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as Wordsworth put it, but also for the personal voice of the authors whose influence went beyond their works, and as Percy B. Shelley claimed in his defense of poetry, they became the acknowledged legislators of the world because of their impact on society through the teaching of literature. However, contrary to what many critics have signaled, this idealist and metaphysical philosophy of art that locates the highest values of aesthetic experience in a realm of organic form, seeing the poem as a verbal icon, a sort of concrete universal, did not serve as a pretext for avoiding any question as to the social and material factors bound up with the work of literary production. So please refer to the video on ekphrasis and intermediality and romanticism for a clear explanation of all these aspects. Continuing on with this reflection on the evolution of critical theory, in the second part of the 19th century, the moral and civilizing imperialist trend of colonial expansion, epitomized in the figure of Matthew Arnold and his volume, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, from 1864, explains the movement of criticism to include prose fiction as part of literature, taking a movement that took place much later in England than in France and Germany. In those countries, the spirit of nation building struggled to construct a canon, that is, a list of works which counted as literature and culture of the group, earlier even than in England. The 20th century, however, began to see trends which descended from the so-called author-centered expressive theory. And, for example, we can see this in the figure of T.S. Eliot, who, writing in Tradition and the Individual Talent, an essay from 1917, argued that the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice and extinction of personality. You have a couple of quotations there from Eliot. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must see him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean, this is a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. And another quotation, what happens is a continual surrender of himself as he is at the moment to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, an extinction of personality. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may set to approach the condition of science, Eliot wrote. And finally, the poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. The interwar modernist period saw the surge of propaganda war that made everyone wary of the double meanings hidden in text messages. So they were seeking simultaneously to give more autonomy to readers, remaining, as James Joyce put it, behind their work, paring their fingernails. You have the quotation there from Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man from 1916. The artist, like the God of creation, remains within and or behind, or beyond, or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. Like Eliot, who was close to Virginia Woolf's father and to her own Bloomsbury group, Woolf thought that, you have the quotation there on your screen, behind the cotton wool is hidden a pattern that all human beings are connected with this, that the whole work is a work of art, that we are parts of the work of art. Hamlet or Beethoven quartet is the truth about this vast mass that we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven. Certainly and empathically, there is no God. We're all the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. And this is from Woolf's Moments of Being. So gradually, all art forms, including literature, came to be treated as cultural products. Their analysis approach from different schools and views that we shall explore in this series of webinars and lectures. Critical theory can thus be classified according to three major trends, centered on the author, the text, or the reader. In the first half of the century, several approaches help understand the nature of discourse and how it functioned in representation, disregarding the search of psychoanalysis, which focused on the author's impact on his artwork. So this lecture is going to explore formalism. Indeed, 20th century literary theory begins with Russian formalism. The formalist movement appeared as a pioneer in the analysis of the form of texts, rejecting the author's psychological, personal, and biographical considerations. It focused first on poetic language among the so-called Moscow Circle, which operated between 1914 and 1915 and promoted linguistics and poetics. It included a number of members. The most important one was Roman Jakobson. and their works were influenced by Husserl's phenomenology. A couple of years later, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, Opoyas, was founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg, which was then known as Petrograd, and after 1924, Leningrad. And the group included Boris Reichenbaum, Lev Yakubinsky, Sergei Bernstein, Viktor Shklovsky, Yuri Tynyanov, and Osip Brick. They all met at Eichenbaum's house, and they were also in relation with Vladimir Propt, who was born in St. Petersburg, and he was not a member of the group, but influenced by their work. Formalism technical approach to textual processes derives from the discipline of linguistics, and it can be linked to Ferdinand de Saussure's ideas on language. The group studied the formal structures that determine the context of literature, that is, the form and context together. For the formalists, the text is regarded as a crafted thing, a work of art or artifact, stressing the materiality of the literary text and the significance of the medium and the context of communication. Formalist criticism was directed at the social level against the decadent bourgeois culture, and at the artistic level against French symbolism, whose subjective and philosophical conception of art went against the scientific and objective attitude of the formalists. After 1924, the opposition to formalism gained strength in Russia. In Literature and Revolution, which was published in that year, Leon Trotsky did not wholly dismiss the formalist approach, but he insisted that the methods of formal analysis were necessary but insufficient, because they neglected the social world with which the human beings writing and reading literature were bound up. So the leaders of the formalist movement began to suffer some political persecution. And Jacobson and Tynyanov wrote Defenses of Formalism in 1928 to summarize the fundamental positions, and but eventually the group had to move to Prague, to the Czech, now the Czech Republic. So Jacobson left Moscow in 1920, and he in 1926 he established the Prague Linguistic Circle, and this group worked in Prague until 1939, when, with the onset of World War II, Jacobson had to relocate. Later, himself and Nikolai Trubetskoy, and as well as René Welek, they all moved to the United States because of their Jewish background. So Jacobson escaped from Prague via Berlin and then Denmark, where he became associated with the Copenhagen Linguistic Circle, including intellectuals such as Louis Helmleslev. As the war advanced west, Jacobson was smuggled into Norway in a coffin with his wife. When Swedish colleagues feared for a possible German occupation, Jacobson managed to leave on a private yacht together with Ernst Cassirer, former rector of Hamburg University. And they landed in New York City, became part of a wider community there of intellectual emigres. In 1949, Jacobson moved to Harvard University, where he remained until his retirement. In this last decade, he maintained an office at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as well, where he was made honorary professor emeritus. Formalists conceived literature as an autonomous and specific domain, characterized by what Jacobson termed the literary. Their main objective was to discover the features of the literary, the only type of text capable of creating aesthetic effects. Jacobson pronounced the poetic function of language, that is, the property that makes literature literary, consisting in a set of aspects relating objects and signs within the message. By message, Jacobson means the form of the language of the text, phonological, graphological, syntactic, and semantic, rather than the communicated aspects or content. So the focus on textual form is achieved by a high level of structuration and concentration on the rhetorical techniques, which, according to Shklovsky, increase the difficulty and length of perception. Shklovsky also affirmed that any new work does not arise to express something new, but to replace the previous one that has lost its aesthetic attitude. This assertion opened the way to perceiving works of art according to their interrelationships. However, for the formalists, theory and history are linked together in a union where works attempt to replace previous productions. So it was Mikhail Bakhtin who would explain that it may not have been entirely a replacement, but a dialogue among different voices, giving rise to the concept of intertextuality later. And we shall have a lecture, a webinar lecture dedicated specifically to Bakhtin's work, which was very, very influential. In Shklovsky's essay Art as Device from 1917, which is considered the manifesto of formalism, he developed the notion of the literary work as a dynamic system of correlations among elements, one of which became dominant among others. All the others accompanied this dominant and intensified through harmony and heightening it through contrast, with including a number of variations that play within the dominant. So this notion was later developed by Jacobson in a lecture entitled The Dominant in 1935. Linked to the notion of artifice, Shklovsky also develops the idea that art refers to a form of de-automation. Literature, he points out, like language, works by surprise, by substituting habitual automized perceptions, shifting expectations, and thus destroying the automatism of everyday perception. According to him, art has the unique capacity to bring to life or reanimate the everyday world made invisible by habit. And I'm quoting from his work, Art as Device. After being perceived several times, objects acquire the status of recognition. An object appears before us. We know it is there because we do not see it, and for that reason, we can say nothing about it. In this complex net of human memories, recognition is the key word that, with the right aesthetic devices, allows us to see the world anew again, to experience it perceptually. So art is a device that touches us effectively and allows the stone become stony, as Shklovsky famously put it. For the Russian formalist critic, the purpose of art is to give a sensation of the object as vision and not as recognition. The procedures of art are that of the singularization of objects, and that which consists in obscuring the form, in increasing the difficulty and duration of perception. Shklovsky asserts that art is thinking in images, and that these images are relatively static, crossing history without change, he says. He adds that images are almost like essences that belong to no one except perhaps to God. And he says that the more you try to explain an epoch, the more you are convinced that these images you thought were created by a given poet were in reality passed on to him by others without hardly a change. He says that images are basic units, possibly invariant because of the physical limitations of human perception and cognition. So his stand is very similar to conceptual metaphor studies nowadays. Aesthetics for Szlowski is the use of identifiable techniques, manipulations of language that cumulatively produce the work of art. And he calls this a device. And the device for for creating this awareness, it's called defamiliarization, in Russian, ostranenie, which means to make strange. So defamiliarization is the crucial way in which literary language distinguishes itself from ordinary communicative language. And it's a feature of how art presents the world as strange and new in order to allow us to see things differently. So his argument reveals ostranenie not just as a device, but also possibly as a consequence of a device, because he illustrates his theory with an example from Tolstoy that focuses on linguistic substitution of a verb with literal description of activity, injecting a bizarre character into the narrative. As we mentioned, repetition, that is the experience within time, is necessary for perception to become both habitual and automatic. Automatic recognition for Szlowski is an algebraic method of thinking in which objects are grasped spatially. The delayed perception produced by art reverses this process. And I'm quoting from Art as Device. The object is perceived not as spatially, but as it were in a temporal continuity. So through art, the spatial becomes the temporal, and recognition returns to vision, he claims. So the life of a poem and of an artistic artifact proceeds from vision to recognition, from poetry to prose, from the concrete to the general, he explains. As the work of art dies, it becomes broader, he says. So Szlowski's description of the transformation of artistic devices from perception to recognition moves first linearly at the level of individual memory, only to transcend to a broader interpretative nonlinear scenario, another level where, using the symbol of poetry and music, he claims, and I quote, "We're dealing here not so much with a more complex rhythm as with a disruption of rhythm itself, a violation, we may add, that can never be predicted." So this unexpected break takes the notion of the device from the linearity of perspectival vision to the oral temporal dimension of simultaneously, the dimension of sound, where the leap to another fractal level of representation it's according to Szlowski, possible. So clearly the notion of ostranenie is related not just to the conditions in which perception moves beyond automatic recognition, but to the aesthetic devices that enable the flight of the mind, that is, the possibility of transcending the contingent by playing in non-linear scales of simultaneously. And this is precisely what the avant-gardes and modernism, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, and the pictorial avant-gardes in the 20th century were exploring. So for Szlowski, oscillation between ostranenie as device, as phenomenon, is similar to the use of metaphor and metonymy, signaling a powerful semiotic tool that seeks to transcend spatial levels to temporal frameworks by assuming specific and even mutant instantiations. And we shall see later how Jacobson also connects the question of metaphor and metonymy, which is one of the crucial aspects in contemporary research on conceptual metaphor. For example, the work of Lakoff and Johnson from the 1980s. Well, in the next slides, I want to offer an example of how Szlowski's account of the device enables to pose questions about, for example, micro-narratives and microfiction. You can see on your screen a number of short fiction pieces written by very well-known authors. And I'm going to do I'm not going to read the pieces, but I'm going to do a sort of an analysis applying formalist theory to, and particularly the idea of estrangement, to the pieces. So, in the case of short narratives, the oral tradition can be considered like the primal scene of these minimal forms of technologies of memory. And these short narratives can be seen as devices designed to capture both attention and recollection as kernels of information. My argument is that short fiction is a node in which the oral and the visual, remember that Szlowski was focusing on this distinction, the temporal distinction between the oral and the visual, this cultural network of memory and language act as a strategic narrative, both in its instability and in between fact-fictional function that attempts to capture attention and reduce it to a mental image. Short microfiction can be considered a device destined to be memorized and recollected in its spatial limitations. As Jacques Derrida would explain, microfiction can claim a presence that actually masks and evokes a loss, because a lot of it, of the meaning, is not encapsulated in what it is said, but in what it is implied. So the central task of short fiction would be to summon up a world and make it vivid to its audiences in a very synthetic form. So microfiction can be understood as a device that draws attention to the paradox of claiming presence out of a sign of absence. On your screen, another piece by Ray Bradbury, another example of microfiction. And my reflection is that microfiction frameworks do away with temporal structures present in longer narrative forms. And this reduction produces an articulated silence, a gap at the heart of the story. For example, in these micro-narratives, conflict is minimalized, and characters are also as if suspended in time and become signs of the unnameable spectral presence, which lie beyond the spatial finitude of the readable text. They are like ghosts, no? So the internal time in microfiction, and that is the links between the narrative situations presented, is almost obliterated. So external time, and this we will explore in another webinar, Jeanette and Paul Ricoeur, theories on time and narrative. So the external time forges links between the text and the cultural situation it represents, and it's activated only on the surface of microfiction. So there is a temporal gap between this internal time and external times that enables a kind of poetic rhythm that yields a ghostly trace behind the apparent simplicity and transparency of the economy of the microstructure. This void opens to the reader in the form of virtual interpretations to this paradoxically absence, which in fact is saturated with plenitude. So the birth of microfiction and short fiction is really a ghost story. So I wanted to include this little example to give you an idea of how formalist concepts can be applied to a very, in this case, a very short piece of criticism, regarding short fiction or microfiction. All these temporal aspects that Shklovsky's art as device presents will be expanded in reception theory by German philosophers Hans-Georg Gadamer, Robert Jauss, and others in the school of Constanza, as well as in Italy by Umberto Eco. And also in deconstruction, as I have mentioned Derrida, but in deconstruction, these temporal gaps and aesthetic distance are also a very important aspects, and they are also explored by Paul de Man's theories of irony, and we will explore these in other webinars. So continuing with the formalist school, alongside Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson developed techniques for the analysis of sound systems in the different languages and inaugurated the discipline of phonology. Jakobson went on to apply these same techniques to the analysis of syntax and morphology, and controversially proposed that they could be extended to semantics, which is the study of meaning in language. Drawing on insights from Harvard semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce, as well as from communication theory, Jakobson proposed methods for the investigation of poetry, music, the visual arts, and cinema. And he also had very important influence on Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, among others. Lévi-Strauss, we have talked about him in the webinar lecture on myth criticism, and Roland Barthes, it's also the topic of another lecture on semiotics. Okay, so Jakobson became a pivotal figure in the adaptation of a structural analysis to disciplines beyond linguistics. For example, he theorized the relationship between metaphor and metonymy, and that would be later expanded to studies on conceptual metaphor. This relationship between metaphor and metonymy was also present in Freudian theory, linking metaphor to association and metonymy to displacement. So for Jakobson, metaphor is substitution of one with something similar, and metonymy is the replacement of one with something close by. So in metaphor, we have like a relation of similarity, and in metonymy, we have a relation of contiguity. Okay, so these are very important concepts, as I said, in conceptual metaphor theories that we will try to explore also in other webinars, and also in psychology, as I said. Finally, on your screen, you have the communicative functions that Jakobson established. The referential function, which allows contextual information, the aesthetic function or poetic function, which is auto-reflective, the emotive function, which functions as self-expression, the conative function, which is a vocative or imperative addressing of the receiver, the phatic, which is related to the channel, and the metalingual, which relates to the code at work in the communication process. So the last figure to mention among the formalists is René Wellek, and he emigrated to the States, teaching first at the University of Iowa and then later at Yale University. And in 1942, with an American, Austin Warren, Wellek published a landmark volume, which is entitled Theory of Literature, and it's one of the first works that try to synthesize literary theory. In the 1960s, Wellek became associated to the school of known as New Criticism, or the Chicago School, and even though he always emphasized the importance of interpretation in literary criticism. He was impatient with purely textual and empirical approaches to literary scholarship, which is the trend that the new critics emphasize, as we will see in another lecture. So in what follows, I'm going to focus on the impact of formalism and on the theories of narrative. And first I'm going to explore a little bit about Russian formalism, and later I'm going to concentrate on different authors coming from the Anglo-Saxon schools. So theories of narrative feature prominently in Russian formalism, specifically the distinction between story and plot. This was not, of course, new in the theory of literature, and the distinction goes back at least to Aristotle, for whom the plot, which he termed mythos, was the arrangement of incidents, and it was clearly different to the story on which it was based. So the time of sequence of events in Greek tragedy, for example, is clearly different to that of the events it relates. So usually tragedies start with a report of what happened before, and then the audience is plunged into the middle of events in what it was called media res, with occasional references back to earlier stages in the story. So formalist Boris Tomayevsky developed further a concept that Shklovsky had first formulated in an essay in which he studied English author Lawrence Sterne and his novel Tristram Shandy. So the basic material of the story was termed fabula, and Tomayevsky contrasted this with sujet, that is, the story as it is actually told. So one fabula can provide material for many sujets, a notion which was taken up by later formalists and was also to provide a link with structuralism. Tomayevsky also contributed with his study on motivation, a relationship that allows the motives to be united, and these are minimal units of thematic material. So this notion of motivation was able to link the concept of fabula as the result of considering the motives in chronological succession and maintaining a logical cause-effect, while sujet, it was the setting of the same motives, but arranged respecting the order that they follow in the work, in the composition. So the English Author E.M. Foster also saw the need to differentiate between plot, which refers to the causal relationship between the facts to produce a desired aesthetic effect, and the story, the narration of the facts considered simply in temporal sequence. So the formalist distinctions are not essentially a reformulation of Aristotelian concepts, because the formalists conceive the effects and purposes of sujet differently to those of Aristotle's mythos. So, for example, Aristotle, plot had to be plausible. It had to have a degree of inevitability and provide insight into the human condition. However, for Russian formalists, on the other hand, the function of plot was to defamiliarize what we are observing, to make us aware of the artificiality of the process of literary creation. So the formalists also had an idiosyncratic notion of motivation, using the concept not with the meaning of intention or purpose, but in relation to the structural concept of motive. Tomayevsky was one of those to elucidate the distinction. So the theme is the central meaning of the story. And to give you an example, in Frankenstein, the theme is humanity's scientific and technological hubris leading to destruction. A motive is a repeated narrative element that supports the theme of the story, and it serves to support through recurring aspects that enhance the narrative. So the motive is a unit of construction, it's the smallest unit of a plot. So Tomayevsky distinguished between bound and free motives. A bound motive is needed for the original story, for example, the dialogue between Walton and Victor Frankenstein at the beginning of Mary Shelley's novel. But a free motive is not necessary in the same way, because it is part of the artifice of the work. For example, Mary's decision to set this scene as part of a diary and a series of letters at the beginning of her novel. So Tomayevsky argued that awareness of the distinction between bound and free motives was necessary, because when an unfamiliar device or free motives is included, it serves for a while to make us aware of the artificiality of the text, but eventually it too becomes familiar and therefore conventional. So, for example, when playing with time sequences became the norm, both in literature and in cinema in the 20th century, then this device could no longer have a defamiliarizing effect. So the link between formalism and modernism is worth exploring. There are very many connections between Virginia Woolf's fiction, or James Joyce and Thomas Mann, all of whom explore the question of time and temporality and the relationship as applied to narrative sequences. Among the formalists, it's also important to mention Vladimir Prop. He was not a member of the formalist circles, but he developed his critical theory in parallel with the formalists. His morphology of the folk tale from 1928 studies a corpus of 100 Russian stories to make a typology of the description of the events and the agents that carry out the actions. And he looks for thematic units that are repeated in the works at the level of fabula, not of sujet. So Prop began to use the same function when referring to the essential reasons, those that had the same function, a distinction later used by structuralists like Algirdas Greimas. So Prop reduced to 31 functions, all the possible alternatives of actions that the characters could perform, considering that there are absences of functions in some stories and repetitions in other stories. He discovered that it was possible to speak of certain constants, he called basic actions, and of certain variables, which were usually the names of the characters, the places where the action took place, and so on. So his final analysis presupposes that it is possible to go back to a hypothetical primary narrative, a tale from which all the other tales originated. And this idea will inspire also anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, psychologist Carl Jung, and mythologist Joseph Campbell. So in this regard, please refer to the webinar lecture on myth criticism to expand knowledge on this topic. So Prop notices that the author is free to use certain aspects. Who does the action? How does he do it? But that authors are almost imposed by the logic of actions, so that creative freedom depends to some extent on the initial situation that is taking place in the genesis of the story. So Prop offers, in addition to the syntagmatic perspective linking the functions, a paradigmatic one that attends to the distribution of functions among the characters. In this way, his 31 functions are divided into 7 actants or agents. He considers them as categories, but without individuality. So, for example, the aggressor or evildoer, the donor or the one that gives the magical object to the main character or hero, the auxiliary, someone who helps the hero, the princess, the character that it's the hero seeking to rescue, the ruler who sends the hero, the false hero or impostor, also opponent. So Prop concludes that the folk tale is built from fixed schemes passed on down from generation to generation. Many of the texts by the Russian formalists were only disclosed in translation in the 60s by Tsvetan Todorov and Yulia Kristeva. The distinction between fable and plot is picked up by Todorov himself, who speaks of history and discourse, a term also proposed by Emil Van Viste in his field of linguistics. As we will explore in another webinar lecture, Roland Barthes distinguishes 3 levels of description in narrative work: that of functions, that of actions, and that of narration. We will see about this. Also, work by Gerald Genet. It's interesting in that it speaks of history, narrative, and narration. And it also refers to the producing narrative act, and by extension to the whole of the real or fictitious situation in which it occurs. So next, we're going to talk about the English critical tradition and see the evolution until the 60s, from the early 20th century until the 60s in this webinar. And there'll be another webinar specializing in narratology, which will focus on new theories coming after the 70s or so. So the English critical tradition can be said to start with the Romantics, as well as with Matthew Arnold, who was writing later in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, American-born writer Henry James, who was following English writers, Walter Scott, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and also French and Russian artists like Balzac, Turgenev, Hawthorne in the United States, developed some interesting alternatives to the formalist critical tradition. So James was the second son of a distinguished family, an American family. His elder brother was the philosopher and psychologist William James. And Henry James moved to Europe and settled in England and became a British subject in 1915. And he's considered one of the forefathers of modernism. He is heir to the pragmatism prevalent in America in the early years of the 20th century. For example, work by semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce. And he was also a passionate critic dedicated to the exploration of the dilemma of introducing technique without sacrificing subject matter. Henry James' The Art of Fiction, which was published in 1884, is a fundamental piece on narrative theory, as well as a response to Walter Besant's The Art of Fiction, which was published the same year. James affirmed that a novel is, in its broadest definition, a direct impression of life that, to begin with, constitute its value, which is greater or less according to the intensity of the impression. This is a quote from him. His great technical contribution to the novel was the development of the point of view. James directed the novel away from the traditional emphasis on plot, which derive from epic and romance antecedents, and regarded character and not plot as central. So the emphasis on point of view is very important, and he modified the traditional omniscient narrator of Victorian fiction. So for James, the aim of the novel is to represent life, but this process involves art and imagination, and the producer and audience creating what he called the atmosphere. You have a quotation from James there: the power to guess the unseen from the seen, the trace the implication of things, to judge the whole piece by the pattern, the condition of feeling life in general so completely that you are well on your way to knowing any particular corner of it. This cluster of gifts may almost be said to constitute experience, and they occur in country and in town and in the most differing stages of education. So James emphasized three concepts: the dramatized consciousness of the individual character, his emotional and moral life as subject, the author's creative transformation of art into life, and the importance of arousing and maintaining the reader's interest. In his text, he creates an ideal reader with a double consciousness involving curiosity but also detachment. James achieves this through the manipulation of voice and point of view, as well as by an imaginary that engages the reader while maintaining ideological control of his texts, in which he exposes diverse forms of social domination, which is his major theme. Amongst James' most powerful devices are the silences and elisions, suppressions, also gesture or actions, whose significance becomes clear in the context of Szlowski's notion of defamiliarization. So an example of this is, for example, his novella The Turn of the Screw, which was published in 1898, and it shows an obsessive intensity conveyed through the first-person narration and by the events of the plot that multiply the supernatural and the psychological readings. Many of James' works investigate knowledge and its limitations through the movement of the novel form, and also celebrate life, especially through art. James' technique is to introduce an economical way, a condensed situation in the opening pages of his stories, combining accuracy with brevity. So every aspect of the network of relations then is made to work towards compression. His scenes are very brilliantly compacted. Rather than an extended account of events, James uses direct speech to create a theatrical tableau that includes various forms of verbal suppression. He modulates point of view by using the description of the outer world as seen through the eyes of the characters, thus introducing a sort of doubtful credibility and vivid but confused inner consciousness. So his buildings, streets, and sometimes the claustrophobic cities of his texts are also heirs to Dickens's tradition. He uses rhythm in his sentences, concatenation of images, disruption of sequences in order to convey what for his protagonist is inevitably and inexplicably vivid. The wanderings and baffledness of the characters map out their inner worlds, intrigues, fears, corruptions, fatal illnesses. There are secrets made known only to the reader, building anticipation of and knowledge of the protagonist. But the characters are still seeking this knowledge. There is an ambiguity of apprehension in the characters, and this alerts the reader of the dangers beneath the apparent surface of the story. So in particular, James makes clear that knowledge is associated with fear. So he balances moments of revelation with hints that signal deeper truths, inaccessible in the words of the novel. And these ellipses of knowledge are left to the reader to be imaginatively constructed. Another writer who also reflects on aspects of narratology is Ian Foster, and his volume Aspects of the Novel, published in 1927, informed by his own experience. Foster writes in two traditions: the Humanistic Tradition, which includes components of nominalism, utilitarianism, admiration for realism, and the prophetic tradition, which has its origin in Platonic and also studies on the Bible, and sees art as an alternative to the world and as a form of intensification of reality. So in the first tradition, we find Aristotle, Horace, Matthew Arnold, Henry James. In the second, we find William Blake, the Shelleys, Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, W.B. Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, and Foster himself. So he tries to do justice to both traditions in this volume. And in the first chapters, he focuses on story, people, and plot, voicing the first tradition. And in the later chapters, which begin with fantasy, they become the aspects of the second tradition become more pronounced. Also in another chapter called Prophecy, Pattern, and Rhythm. Foster's book was a response to Henry James' critical legacy, which argued for the importance of point of view, as we have mentioned. But Foster believes that point of view is overstressed and that one must pay attention to characterization in the distinction between flat and round characters. So he proposed that flat characters can be summarized in a single phrase, and they are caricatures, and that round characters are complex and they resemble real people. So you have a quotation there from Foster. The test of a round character is whether it is capable of surprising in a convincing way, and it has the incalculability of life about it. Life within the pages of a book. So like other major modernists, Conrad, Lawrence, Joyce, Woolf, Foster understood that human character is continuously changing. It's a flux of experience rather than an essence depicted in traditional realistic novel of manners, static. No, consequently, in his novels, he sought to dramatize states of mind at crucial moments in the plot. By stressing the primacy of character over plot, and rejecting at the same time Henry James' emphasis on point of view, Foster continued the movement away from traditional stress on plot. F.R. Leavis' The Great Tradition from in 1948 is another landmark in the study of narratology. Between 1932 and 1953, Leavis had been an editor to the scholarly journal Scrutiny. The journal sought to bring the academic world closer to the social world by asserting an influence on education and the universities. And like Matthew Arnold, Leavis believed that the study of English literature could play a major role in social life, and that the presence of literary criticism, not just in philosophy, it should contribute to the development of public to critical consciousness. So the Great Tradition starts with a chapter on Henry James and includes a reprint of some of Leavis' essays published in the journal Scrutiny. Leavis stresses that literature is not merely an extension of life, but that its raw material is taken from reality, but then fiction imposes a set of organizing principles upon life. And he uses the terms essential organization, organization of vital interest, intensely significant organization, and so on. He insists that great novelists are concerned with form and organization. So, like Henry James, Leavis prefers the concrete to the abstract. Dramatic moments, dialogue to narrators telling, and he also prefers realism. First and foremost, he explains that the work must dramatize its values by means of concreteness and particularities of situations or responses to a situation. So concreteness, it's according to Leavis, derived from a dramatic moment. And Leavis was also unsympathetic to the feminist movement and attacked Virginia Woolf's polemic volume, Three Guineas. He was accused of narrowness by authors like George Orwell, who compare him in his last review for The Observer, written in 1949, with a tyrannical schoolmaster because of his resistance to include avant-garde experimentation in the great canon. And Tolkien was also very critical with Leavis' approach. Among the female critics, we can mention Dorothy Van Gant, whose volume, the English novel Form and Function from 1953, had a profound impact on the teaching of English novel in Britain. She understands the novel as a human experience and argues that each novel should be studied within its physical and cultural context at a specific time and place. She was primarily concerned with the moral values of art and how literature can affect the quality of one's moral life. So for her, the literary form is the moral shape imposed upon characteristic events that make up a narrative. So the quotation from her work you have on your screen: the form of the book is the content, the form is the book itself, when she insists that we cannot dissociate the author's conception of life and its value and significance from the aesthetic structure of the literary work. Another important book on critical theory is Erich Feuerbach, Mimesis from 1953. and it focuses on the way imaginative literature imitates and reflects reality, including the culture in which it was written. So Auerbach's subject is, as he puts it, and I quote, the history of the literary treatment of reality. So for Auerbach, art is about something other than art, the writing of novels or the investigation into how language means. The German critics is interested not only in how people behave and in what people believe, but in what historical forces shape behavior and belief. So the artist, for him, should establish a compelling link between individual events or relationships in a specific social and economic milieu as a response to historical forces. So, mimesis inquires into the style that the author uses to present his interpretation of reality. Like Mikhail Bakhtin and Giambattista Vico before him, Auerbach assumes that language is the repository of cultural history. Auerbach begins mimesis by differentiating between two major traditions of narrative presentation: the Homeric or classical, which depends on earthly relations of place, time, and cause, and the biblical one, which depends on vertical connections ascending from all that happens converging into God. So in the Homeric literature, details are scrupulously externalized, visible and palpable in all their parts, and completely fixed in their spatial and temporal relations. By contrast, the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac in the Old Testament focuses on inner experiences that allegorically signify something else. So Auerbach regards modern realism as the integration of these two impulses: the classical one that imitates reality by crystallizing a culture, and the biblical one that seeks to render historical process into a teleology or organizing principle. And you have on your screen several quotes from Auerbach mimesis, which specifically refer to what I have just mentioned. Coming now to the 60s, the Rhetoric of Fiction by Wayne Booth differentiate between poetics, the study of what the work is, what it has been made to be, and rhetoric, what the work is made to do. So Booth writes that the kind of actions authors perform on readers differ markedly, though subtly, from the kinds of imitation of objects that are seen as making in the poetic mode. So he explains that autonomous texts derive from conscious and unconscious decisions made by the author to shape the reader's response. So Booth insists that an author affects the reader as the author intends and communicates human emotions and values to an audience. So the reader in turn responds to the felt presence of a human voice within the text. So although Wayne Booth was not a follower of the Chicago School of Criticism, the New Critics, and he criticized the use of the term house of fiction, which was borrowed by this school from Henry James. He applied the concept to the idea of the self-dramatizing narrator as the basis for inquiries into irony, tension, and ambiguity. However, unlike the new critics, Booth was concerned with the art of communicating with readers, not concentrating only on the text. So he thought that it was possible to find out the rhetorical resources available to the writer, which could be used consciously or unconsciously in order to impose a fictional world upon the reader. So, in a way, he returned to Aristotle's concept of poiesis as a dynamic, non-static effect of the text. Like Leavis and others, Booth believed that reading literature helps people achieve critical consciousness, makes them better people by providing them with values. By rhetoric, the title that appears in his Rhetoric of Fiction, and by rhetoric, Booth means both how books communicate with readers and specifically how books arouse interests in the readers about issues and the characters in the imaginary worlds that affect us morally. So one of his major legacies is the distinction between reliable and unreliable narrators. And you have a quotation there. I have called narrator reliable when he speaks for or acts in accordance with the norms of the work, which is to say, the implied author norms, and unreliable when he does not. So for Booth, reliability is in itself a value. The art of constructing reliable narrators is largely that of mastering all of oneself in order to project the persona, the second self, that really belongs in the book. So the function of reliable commentary is to shape the beliefs of the reader and in part convince him or her that the material is morally significant. So to finish this lecture, I would like to mention very briefly Frank Kermode's The Sense of an Ending, Studies in the Theory of Fiction, 1967. Kermode focuses on the role of the reader in giving meaning to literary texts and criticizes formalism and new criticism for their only emphasis on the form of the text. Although he understands the novel as a self-enclosed fictive universe with its own cosmology and inner geography, he terms it a bibliocosmos. Kermode focuses on temporal aspects, on how in modernism time is fundamental, but it's converted into a space. And he claims that this temporal perception of represented space followed scientific advances at the time. For example, Einstein's theory of relativity is crucial in Finnegan's Wake, the last novel written by James Joyce. No? On your screen, a quotation from Kermode talking about Sartre, where he says that Sartre himself provides a more inclusive formula when he says that the final aim of art is to reclaim the world by revealing it as it is, but as if it had its own source of human liberty. So this statement, according to Kermode, does two things. First, it links the fictions of art with those of living and choosing, and secondly, it means that the humanizing of the world's contingency can not be achieved without a representation of that contingency. This representation must be such that it induces the proper sense of horror at the utter difference, the utter shapelessness, the utter inhumanity of what must be humanized. So the term contingency here refers to a future event or circumstance which is possible but cannot be predicted with certainty. So contingency refers to the relationship between the internal and the external environmental organizations. And it's a crucial concept in dynamic systems theory, also known as chaos theories, which we shall explore in another webinar. So thank you very much for your attention.